So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Karen O'Neill, Senior Vice President with Ipsos UU. Karen, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. So as Ellen said, I'm Karen, and I work in our qualitative division here at Ipsos. Prior to coming to Ipsos, I worked on the client side of market research for a number of years. So I'll probably reference both of those experiences as we have our conversation here today. And with me today is Victoria. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi there, Karen. Vic Guy, Head of Ethnography for North America. I've been at Ipsos for coming on 14 years, 11 of which was in the UK and Europe, and in the last couple of years have moved over to take care of the team here in the US.
And we're glad that you did, Vic. So as you heard, Vic is our ethnography expert here in the conversation today. So I will try to represent some of the other types of qualitative just to make sure we're covering all of our bases in today's discussion, which is really going to be about the big pivot or shift that we have seen in qualitative research as a result of the pandemic. And what we mean by that is much like in many of your industries where you have seen, a big change, a big shift driven by the pandemic. In many cases, it may have accelerated a trend that was already underway prior to the pandemic. Similar things, of course, have happened in qualitative research. So what we'll talk about are some of the pleasant surprises that we've uncovered as part of that, a few tips and tricks along the way, and then what we think that means for the future of qualitative research and the kinds of projects that we do together. So Vic, actually I'll talk about this one. So prior to COVID, we definitely did online research. We did, online communities and many sorts of things, co-creation. However, there were a number of kinds of objectives for which we were really dedicated to the power of in-person research. So things like when we were going after those deep human insights, when we were trying to generate empathy in decision makers, when we were observing behavior firsthand and trying to look at some of the differences maybe between what people say and what people do, when we wanted to see things happen in their real context as they happen, when we wanted to create experiences, so many other objectives. So as qualitative researchers, we really felt that in-person research played a super important role in our portfolio of methodologies. And then, of course, we hit Friday the 13th. So, as the pandemic came upon us, you all remember, and sort of how the different phases of how it happened. And we began to pull some things out of the field and pivot them to online. And really when it all came to a head finally was this Friday the 13th and right around there. So we had some research in the field in Spain, as an example, in Madrid, and we were working with our Ipsos Madrid team, and they said, in the culture here, people really prefer to do the research face-to-face. They really do not prefer to do it online. So they really encouraged us to keep it face-to-face, and we did that as long as we could. And actually, I see some folks on here that were part of some of these pivots that we did, some of these in-person projects that we had that we pivoted to online. So I wish I could call on you as part of this, but the platform doesn't allow us to do that. So we had this research in the field in Spain. And, when this came to a head was when our team said, okay, all of a sudden now we're on lockdown, the police are in the streets, things are changing rapidly. We also had some research in the field in Florida, and you may recall that, Miami was one of the earlier places we started to hear about cases. And so with growing concerns, we really kind of pivoted everything to online and said, this is temporary. We had the best made plans, we had dates and gates and milestones, and said, okay, this is temporary, and then we'll return to just the way we did things before. In terms of doing face-to-face research. And of course, everybody knows the best laid plans in a pandemic and what happens to those. That said, we were really very pleasantly surprised and delighted with how we were able to get to some of that depth via online research. So Vic, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk us through some of these surprises.
Yeah, I mean, to start with, it was a bit of an unpleasant surprise for me, I must say. So, as someone who heads up a team of ethnographers, anthropologists, we specialize in perhaps the most intensive face-to-face method around. So, pre-pandemic, we would spend all day in people's homes. We would study what they eat, where they shop, how they live. We would spend days at a time in doctors' offices, studying body language in consultations between patients and physicians and banks, whatnot. We were right there. And indeed, one of the mantras that, I've been talking about my entire career is, we walk a mile in someone's shoes, yeah? And to do that right, you do that in person. And I think I'd also said previously, it's not to say that previously you can do good qual online, but I had previously said you could not do good ethnography online. I'm here today in front of all of you to eat my words. And I think we can, and indeed we are. And today we're going to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned. So as Karen was saying, I'll focus on digital ethnography, but we're also looking at kind of online qual as well. So in anthropology, we talk about kind of working in people's natural habitat. We like to understand their world. We like to understand context. Well, online now is the new reality for many of us. Karen and I are at home today. We do everything online. We personally, as a family, start our mornings every day talking to Granny back in the UK. She's very isolated, so we want to stay in touch with her. We then come online for work. I've got a doctor's appointment on Friday. We've got drinks on Friday online. This is our new reality. Actually going into a facility or a client's office or someone coming to our house would feel quite weird now. So we're quite practiced at being in home. And with both of us being at home, so the participants, clients, with everybody being at home, actually what we're finding is we're able to build connections, but ultimately get to those kind of deeper insights that help answer some of our clients' business questions. A couple examples that I have, I recently was doing an interview with someone. I must say I was kind of struggling to connect with her. And then I noticed her face she had a funny look on her face. And then she stopped me halfway through a sentence and she was like, "Do you need to go and get that baby that's crying?" And I was like, "Can you hear that?" I didn't realize she could hear the baby in the background screaming. And indeed, I was like, no, I don't, he's just screaming himself to sleep. That's fine. So that's kind of an insight into my parenting technique there. And actually that really helped there was some tension there that needed to go away, and it really kind of helped us connect. Another example of connecting with a participant and kind of seeing what was going on around her. I think you might actually see her in the next slide. I could see on the walls around her, she had a guitar, she had kind of fabric and crochet, a sewing machine, and I kind of pointed that out to her. And actually that was a very revealing moment, in so much as she could no longer do those things. They meant a lot to her. She had a degenerative muscle condition. And that got us to a place where we spoke to something really emotional, actually, that we might not have got to before had I not seen that on her walls. Another example as well, clients are at home. And I was on quite a tense chat with a very senior client who was in a pharmaceutical company, and there was many of us on this call, and we could hear this kind of ruckus in the background for 45 minutes of this call. Then eventually it got too much for him, and he kind of turned around, he started shouting, and he was like, "I'm so sorry, I've got 3 teenage boys in the background." And I was like, yeah, we could hear that. You could hear someone in a headlock. And that taught me 2 things. I think empathy for the fact that I've only got 1 child at home, he's got 3 teenage boys he's trying to keep a handle on, and 2 is that's why this guy's in charge. He's such a cool customer that he could just get through 45 minutes of shouting while also having this presentation. I kind of learned a lot. But it's not always easy. It doesn't always build connections as well. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next section about how we can kind of keep on top of those boundaries. Pre-COVID, when we did things in person, we tended to do them kind of in a one-off fashion. So we think of groups, facility, even in home ethnography. It might vary in length, but we tended to do them kind of on one day. And actually what we're finding now is we don't have that. And that was because of the logistics and the expense of organizing multiple visits. That's quite challenging. But with online, what we're finding is we're designing more studies that are longitudinal. And this is interesting because it helps us build deeper relationships relationships, and again, get to those deeper insights with our consumers, with our patients. I have a friend, my old boss, actually, she's a therapist. She talks about in therapeutic practice. She says to me, Victoria, therapy doesn't start for 6 months. And having been through therapy myself, I'm like, oh my goodness, that's a lot of money to be spending, and don't get to the good stuff until 6 months. And she's saying, I want to get beyond what's top of mind. And I think that's really something we're seeing in longitudinal studies with people as well. One of the things I really love to hear from folks is this top quote here. I've been thinking since we spoke last time. I've been thinking about that discussion we had, and actually I have something to add. The other thing we hear a lot as well is I can no longer go shopping. I can't shop online or go in person now because I'm imagining how I might film that footage for you. And that is something that has been really interesting to behold as well.
One thing, Vic, that I'll just mention on this slide as it pertains to other types of qualitative as well. So when we think about things like co-creation and work with groups, this ability to reconnect with them longitudinally can be very helpful there as well, because we find that, as we reconnect with that group, we've already formed the group, we've already built the rapport, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So then the next time they get together, we can kind of A, jump right into the objectives more so, and B, they're more apt to challenge each other and, have build on each other, things like that, because again, the group is already formed and they've already built relationships. So it can also kind of pertain to that context.
Right. Yeah. And one of the other things as well that we're seeing, which is a really wonderful surprise, has been more diversity in recruitment. We have a picture of a tractor here. I had a gentleman recently. We took our weekly call on a tractor. He was not driving the tractor. The research was not about tractors, but he was in a rural community. So we're seeing kind of a rural-urban spread that we might not have seen before. Ethnic diversity as well. We've had a number of transgender folk in our studies, which has been brilliant to see. I've recently finished a couple of studies in schizophrenia and bipolar. Again, kind of what we would call more difficult to find or hard to reach groups. We're finding more of this diversity in some of our online work. I think some of the reasons why that might be the case, we've got transportation barriers have been removed. It feels familiar, as I was saying before. That's how we're doing our life. It doesn't feel strange to kind of go online. Perhaps people have less social plans, have more time on their hands, but I think there's something around this being a safe space for communities who typically might not want to kind of go into a facility and engage with strangers. This is something that we're seeing as well. One thing that's worth noting is that we're still not engaging the underserved. Yeah, so those that have access to technology, it's an issue for the broader population in relation to kind of schooling, for example. That's something I think certainly that we would need to address with continued digital in the future.
And one thing I'll build on that last point you made, Vic, is that actually sometimes it's not as much of a barrier as we think it may be. So I'll give a couple of examples. One is that we did work with blind and low vision consumers online, and via, by partnering with expert groups, we were able to make that work very seamlessly. And then we've also done work with in countries where older people do not consistently have access to online. We have been able to execute that work by recruiting someone to assist the person and kind of provide some light tech support and things like that. So I think you're absolutely right about sort of the underserved, and at the same time, there are sometimes ways that we can work through some of those barriers. So another pleasant surprise, I would say, as we think about what we've learned taking everything digital through the pandemic, is that we can break some of the rules. So one of the topics I'll talk about here is international co-creation. So conventional wisdom would say to do your co-creation kind of one country at a time. So I'll give you an example of when I was on the client side. We were building a brand and it was for older consumers. And so we did a bunch of work in the US, and we're feeling really great about our proposition. And then we took that to Japan, and it was streamed quals, so we didn't have to travel there. It wasn't a huge lag time, but it was sequential. And we took that proposition to Japan, and boy, are the semiotics of aging and the expectations of how you depict aging different in Japan than they are in the US. And there's such a role for cultural understanding there in terms of, upfront and designing a global proposition, but also in terms of how you do the work. So, again, we're kind of breaking some of the rules now. So we said, we're doing this digitally. What if we brought consumers together from different countries as part of a co-creation who all speak the same language? So we've done some things, for example, where we might bring together a group where some people are from the UK and Russia, and I think we had someone from China, and see how can we kind of create a deliberate cultural collision that enable us to progress a concept like that faster, and then also create something, whether it's a proposition or a campaign, that could potentially travel further.
One of the things, Karen, as you're speaking this, you use the words breaking the rules twice. And I think there's a flexibility and an openness now that didn't exist before. I think yesterday I went to get lunch, I went to the salad bar, and they had no chicken. And, they mainly served chicken salads, and there was a whole queue of people, and everyone was okay with that, that it didn't get delivered, or there was a COVID related kind of reason why that was happening. And I think this idea of kind of, okay, we're going to change things up. We can't do it the way that we expected. That is of this time. And I think it's brilliant because it's forcing us to do things in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. So another pleasant surprise has been the ability to engage broader multifunctional teams and decision makers. And the reason I say that that's a bit of a surprise is, again, kind of coming from the client side, people were always trying to pitch me kind of online collaboration tools and co-creation tools. And I don't know about you guys, but my experience was so much of the time people end up multitasking, right? And it was hard to keep them engaged. And of course, things are a little different. As Victoria said earlier, we're living everything online now. So just the rules of engagement are a little bit different. But also, through kind of the proper facilitation, we can take advantage of the fact that we can get people from a very broad geographic area to engage in the same research or the same workshop. So as an example, we had one piece of research in a Spanish-speaking country, and we had 70 people from that client who spoke Spanish from around the world. I suppose you could do that with translation as well, but they just happened to speak Spanish in this case, all dialing in from different countries, 70 people. And then we had somebody dedicated to facilitating that sort of virtual back room. So, kind of managing the conversation there, coming up with the themes of the questions, and then asking some of those questions at the end of the engagement. So with the right facilitation, you can reach a much broader kind of audience of your team than you have been able to before. And the other example I'll give is we're doing a lot of virtual sprints. And so for those of you that are familiar with sprints, sprints are a way to make a lot of progress in a short amount of time. So traditionally, you are iterating through kind of rounds of consumer input and rounds of workshopping, whatever your stimulus is, whether it's a concept or a package or proposition or campaign, whatever it is. So you can kind of iterate through that, getting the input. And then at the end of the sprint, typically you are trying to drive a decision. So what we found again is, so many of us work globally or nationally in different cities. So again, taking advantage of the fact that we're all virtual, we're much more able to engage those teams and decision makers and get them kind of all collaborating in the virtual space. So that has been a pleasant surprise. Where we had feared potentially lower engagement, we're actually getting higher engagement with the right preparation. And in general, I would say that preparation is important. So, a lot of these things don't just sort of work on their own. You have to put in the right legwork to make it happen. And so we'll talk through a few of those tips and tricks here. So the first one I'll say is not just in terms of engaging your team and our clients, your team audience. We also have to do a lot of prep work in terms of how we think about engaging consumers. And we'll talk about kind of rapport building and keeping them engaged in a minute, but even just up front, obviously we're screening for engagement typically, But a nuance of online research, if you're doing something, you're not doing something ethnographic where you want to see, everything very, very, very natural. You want to actually have a conversation. You have to set some of those expectations, or we have found through, our many moderators in the field, you may end up with someone who's in bed or not wearing clothes or driving or multitasking. And I'm sure those of you who have kids in online school can relate to this picture of the person, multitasking on YouTube or gaming or something like that. I know one of my kids got his highest ever score on Tetris while he was supposed to be in online school, so we're very proud of that. But obviously multitasking can be part of the online game if you're sort of not appropriately facilitating and engaging. So Vic, I think on the ethnography side, you guys have some unique preparation you do as well.
Yeah, I mean, pre-COVID, we were sending out people with masters in visual anthropology to kind of spend time study behavior, but now we're getting, regular folks to send us that footage. So what we're having to do is we're having to train them how to film. So we have, some easy read kind of ways in which kind of here's some of the basics. Think about the sound, think about the light. Again, we're not going to, they're never going to be Spielberg. That's okay. And we've also got demonstrative films that we've created. Again, there's that idea of reciprocity. So we're kind of sharing something about ourselves, and so getting to teaching them and getting them again to perhaps send us, footage of them making dinner, out and about shopping, etc.
Yeah, and we started to talk a little bit about, building the rapport. And we also find online that you have to build rapport in sort of uniquely digital ways. So, as Vic said earlier, everybody is in their home. So that opens up some unique opportunities in many cases. Find something in your home, like show us a plant that's special to you. Show us something that means something to you. Tell us about it. It's a way to elicit some of those stories that can build rapport. You can see in the second picture there's my Microsoft Teams background that I've used sometimes. Sometimes we'll ask people to create a background that tells something about themselves and use that as kind of a rapport building exercise. So in this case, this is a picture of my backyard. It's in the snow. The deer are out there. And one of the deer, I don't think you can tell in the picture, happens to have 3 legs. So that can be kind of a conversation starter. Interestingly, one time when I was sharing this, a man said, I'd love to come and bring my crossbow and shoot your deer. And I didn't know that he was a hunter. So, we both could bond over a shared love of the outdoors, perhaps in some different ways. But, some of these exercises can kind of open up a conversation and start that rapport building. On the lower left there, you can see with the yellow, that is a picture from our Syncytium avatar quiz. So Syncytium is a way of understanding human motivations. And our Syncytium Institute has come up with this little quiz. It's much like a BuzzFeed quiz. So as somebody's logging on, they can fill out the quiz, and then they have their avatar, and that can be a great way to kind of start the conversation as well. And then, of course, we can do, uniquely digital things depending on the demographic and if it's relevant and their habits and things like that. Everyone can make a TikTok and things like that. So that said, I know, and particularly in ethnography, Vic, where you guys get so close sometimes to your consumers, there can be a discussion about boundaries.
Yeah, and that has been an interesting one. And I think that has come from the longitudinal nature of our studies. We're seeing these folks, we're getting a lot of video in from them. And this idea, we're both in one another's homes. And I think those boundaries have been more of a challenge in the digital space. Knowing what to share and what not, I think, is something that we have learned. I think there's an experience factor that comes in here as well. I think with a few of our junior folks, there's been more coaching needed on how to kind of manage those boundaries. But I think that's something certainly that has been a really interesting one for us in the past 12 months.
Yep, for sure. So in another kind of tip that we would give is, when you're doing all your research online, is to not just have all your stimulus be sort of a plain PowerPoint slide, but how can you get creative with your stimulus? So we've done a number of different things in the space, and here's just a few examples. In one case up at the top there, we were working with someone in the food business, and they had some products to show, but it wasn't something that they were able to send out at that point. That said, it had to be represented in a way that it was appetizing and the lighting was right and all of these things. So our moderator actually set up a home studio where she was able to present everything, sort of in the appropriate lighting and make it really come to life. In the middle example there, sometimes we find that we need to see somebody as they're using a product. Might need to see them applying it or how they're interacting with it. So there are times that we have shipped out additional cameras that focus just on their hands, as an example. And then finally, unboxing is kind of a fun experience depending on your generation, may or may not be relevant. That's the kind of thing that we can bring into it too. So one thing we'd recommend and we try to do with Stimulus is try to create something that's a little bit more tangible and not just kind of the PowerPoint on a screen. Again, takes a little bit of preparation, but can make it a lot more engaging and get you some better input along the way. And another area of pointers that I'd share is to tap into the power of relationships. So we talked a little bit about that. Vic talked about this reciprocity and things like that. But the first example I'll give, this was a piece of research, the friendship groups, where we had, prior to the pandemic, planned to do in-homes. And it was something about snacking and moms and things like that. So we were going to go into these homes and have these moms, show us around and do the research that way. And so having to pivot, we decided to do friendship triads in this case. And so these were 3 moms at a time that knew each other. Their kids knew each other. In many cases, they kind of knew what the other's snacks had in their homes. They could build off each other, joke around with each other. And so through the richness of that relationship, we actually got to better insights than we would have gotten through the original plan of doing in-homes one at a time. So something kind of flipped it on its ear. Initially, we probably would have thought that doing the work in context in the actual home would be richer, but it turned out that through the friendship groups, we got to be deeper, better insights. So Vic, I know sometimes in ethnography, you guys leverage family members as well. So maybe you could speak to the next one.
Absolutely. And this is something we're doing a lot in healthcare, especially. So speaking to care partners, that could be a husband or wife and an adult child. And I think there's something very interesting in having that joint interview one week and then having separate interviews another. Again, there's kind of some tensions and discord there, or looking at the difference between what they're saying together, what they're saying separately, etc. Also doing that in financial services. And again, what are the kind of joint goals that you might have as a household? And do they play out differently when you speak to people individually? And again, this last point here, I've kind of spoken about that. We're able to build relationships with people when the research takes place over time.
Yep, and the last tip that I'd share is to pace appropriately for online. So you can see on the left here, an example of something that might be used in a projective technique. We do a lot of projective techniques and use of metaphors, and for example, like in our syncytium kinds of research. And one thing that our moderators are finding is that, in the past in person, where we might have just continued to go deeper and probe and ladder kind of off of one exercise, sometimes with the pacing of online, it actually is, feels more natural to people to do multiple exercises, keep the pacing going a little more quickly, and kind of use those together to get to the same conclusion. And then the second point, the overall time, mind the overall time, that I would make is in talking to our moderators, every single person says online is more exhausting. And it seems like a little counterintuitive, because you'd think that, going in homes, spending whole days traveling between homes, things like that, could be more tiring. But there's something about this sort of, face-to-face constant engagement of online that is really, really exhausting. And so we've heard from some of the moderators, no more than 90 minutes for some of these engagements. And just as an example, we recently had a meeting internally that we would have taken 3 days to do in person. We did it in a little less than half a day, and I think we were all still exhausted afterwards. So pacing is definitely something that we've been thinking about differently for online. So, all of that said, through some of these keys to success, we have really been able to get to richer, deeper insights than we ever expected that we could via online research. That said, we're starting to see some of the light at the end of the tunnel as it comes to the pandemic, let's hope, depending on who you talk to. So we're getting a lot of questions from clients in terms of what happens next. When we go back to normal, are we going to just, go right back to face-to-face? And what do we think about the future of qualitative research? And again, if this had just been, a kind of a couple week disruption, I think that we would have had a very different answer. But just like, when we talk about the kinds of habits in your category, as people find rewards to things, they'll continue to do them. And so we did find some absolutely unexpected rewards as we did online research. And so we think that there is a definite role for it going forward. As we think about face-to-face, though, we think there's also a role for face-to-face research. So we're starting to see some return to face-to-face research, and sometimes it's a little bit of, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing as the pandemic evolves. But the first place that we're really seeing it come back are the contexts that feel most natural to respondents. And what I mean by that are people are already going places. So we're doing research in stores, we're doing research in restaurants, we're doing research in banks, places that people are already going feel much more natural than opening your door and letting someone into your home for half a day at this point. So those are the contexts that we're starting to see come back first. And then Vic, as we were talking about this, I know that you had some interesting points from an ethnographic standpoint. So
yeah, I mean, just even from a personal perspective, I think just like it was weird when we left the office and we kind of came in home, it's going to be difficult to go back. It's going to be difficult to go back to having to engage people all day in the office, make small talk, go out with friends in the evening. This is a muscle that we've not flexed for some time, and doing that in person is different. So just like in our personal lives, I think there's going to be a re-entry period also within the research world as well. We're going to have to take our time. I think suddenly kind of having an ethnographer in your home all day, that's going to take folks a while to get used to. So I don't see us kind of just going 100% back to face-to-face. It'll take a little bit of time. I think as Karen was saying here, the third point here, we're going to prioritize where it needs first-hand observation, looking for that say-do gap. This is a really interesting image here from a study that was around parenting, and this kind of lovely image on the left, we've got the girls' bedroom in pink and the boys' bedroom in blue. I think a lot of the work that we do in doctors' offices, where there's kind of, where we're looking at the unsaid, what is the body language and what is happening and how does the environment feel? Those are the scenarios I think we'll prioritize first as we kind of ease back into people's homes.
Yeah, I love that example on the right, because that was something in that research that family never said anything about gender roles or anything like that. And then you're able to go in the home and observe and see something that then gave you an additional potential insight area.
Right.
So while we see a lot of richness to online, there are times that I think that we're going to want to get back to face-to-face for some of that observation. That said, we expect our clients to be traveling less. So we did a study, Ipsos did a study with the Point Sky and saw that, the majority of companies are planning to reduce their travel budgets. We have heard it from some of our clients for sure. So what we're preparing for are things like there may be cases where you want to see the in-context environment, and if we deem that it's, an appropriate kind of time and situation in which to do that research in context, that we would be prepared to stream that so that our clients can kind of have that experience remotely. So it's actually a little bit of a blended approach from that standpoint. And we really expect in general many more mixed methodology projects because, as I think about, behavioral science and what we've learned about habit adoption and things like that, we know that habits are more likely to stick and behaviors are more likely to stick if there are rewards to them. And as we've been talking about, there's some real rewards and unexpected richness to doing online research. So for example, this idea of building relationships over time is something that we definitely don't want to lose when we bring face-to-face back into the toolkit. So we're expecting in general, many more mixed methodologies. Maybe we have an interview, maybe we're keeping in touch digitally in between. maybe we're spending some time in home, but, more of thinking about, which touch point is going to bring you kind of which piece of information and how is that done most effectively. Vic, is there anything that you wanted to build on this from ECE standpoint?
No, I think you've hit the nail on the head there, Karen. I think for me going forward, I would like to see, a gold standard study for me would be some of the interviews in home for sure. If I think about, and then some digitally, if I think about what I like from one versus the other, I think you can see some real surprises when you're in home that you might not have, that the participant doesn't think to share with us. But I think there's these hidden moments digitally in the middle of the night, over time that we can see that I would hate to miss. So yeah, I see mixed method for us as well in ethnography moving forward.
Yeah, and I remember when we first started talking about this, you said something along the lines of, when all of this started, we felt this was very temporary, and then we would go back to doing it properly. Yeah. And we no longer feel that way, right? Because of sort of what we have learned how to do along the way to get to that richness. Again, online has always been there, but we've found this sort of unexpected richness to it. And then, of course, we're working on some new approaches. So I mentioned, some of those deliberate cultural collisions and how we can leverage cultural intelligence. That's a big passion area of ours with all the countries that we're in. Taking some of our most physical approaches to a virtual world and seeing what kind of additional richness we can get there. So, Lifehouse is an approach we have that's kind of like the real world or Big Brother, where everybody's in the house and there are different rooms and you're doing different things in different rooms. And maybe there's a confessional and there's another room where you're using products or having an experience. So how can we take some of that virtually and enhance the learning there, as well as, just sort of products where we blend the physical and digital. So just some of the areas that, we think that there's innovation opportunity as we go forward as we kind of blend these worlds together. So Victoria, why don't you wrap us up here?
Yeah, so just in conclusion, I think we as people over the last year or so, we've seen such a profound shift in the way that we connect with one another, whether that's family, whether that's colleagues, friends, and we do it because we're social beings. And what's his name? Paul Bloom, the Canadian psychologist, says we're social beings. We're happier and better when we connect to others. And I think as an industry, I'm confident that as qualitative researchers, we'll continue to seek out those ways to connect in a meaningful manner with our participants, be they consumers or patients, and we'll continue to evolve and get to those deeper insights. So that's it from Karen and I think I'll move us forward. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I can take a look at the questions for us, Vic. Okay, so one question that we have is, you talked a lot about building relationships. So when you build relationships with your respondents, and I think, Vic, you used the term reciprocity at one point, does it bias or change the nature of the research? So I think that's a great question, maybe one you could answer from an ethnography standpoint.
Yes, absolutely it does. This is a question I've been asked a few times. So is it, should you be there sharing something about yourself because it might influence the research in some way, or does it influence the research? And the answer, firstly, in my mind, is absolutely it does. And that's okay. I think this idea, and in my mind, it's a little bit dated as well, this idea of, you must come as a black box to a research question in order to answer it. And I think that comes from a really kind of scientific background of I need to recreate this thing in a lab. And that's not what we're doing in qualitative research. For sure, we should think about our positionality and the effect that we might have on a piece of work. Absolutely. That's why we have a wonderful kind of diverse moderator bench. And sometimes there'll be more tricky participants where we do have to kind of set those boundaries. But I think acknowledging that, you have an impact and bring yourself into the work, I think that is what we've seen here, is that we can't have that kind of, we can't have that barrier, but actually that leads to these wonderful connections and these wonderful insights.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. There's a little bit of a maybe a belief of the past that people could sort of act like robots and
Right.
just play it totally straight, but that's not how we are as humans.
Yes, and I think that's going to be a lovely thing moving forward. I think we've been able to see that, we've got messy lives. You can see them in the background as I look at that shelf behind me. I'm like, that should probably do with a tidy. But that's okay. And I think I would love to see that moving out of the pandemic, and acknowledgement of, us as messy beings, I think would be a great result.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Okay, what would you not continue to do online if you didn't have to?
So, I think I kind of spoke about this really briefly before of this kind of, I guess one of the questions is, what's the difference between, in the ethnography space, digital ethnography and face-to-face ethnography? And I think this is idea of surprises. I think we get way more surprises when we go there in person. Because you've got an anthropologist's eye. I think one of the kind of limitations is that folks are choosing what to show us. So I feel like in those studies like that, I would want to, they're best suited for us to go there in person and observe. And I want the anthropologist, the specialist who can kind of see the unsaid. So I think that's certainly in the kind of the ethnographic space, what I'd like. But then I like with digital ethnography, these hidden moments, as I say. So we've just done a study recently in narcolepsy. We were able, they're filming in the middle of the night when they're having night terrors, when they, there's a woman who thought that someone had kind of come to kill her, or someone had what's called a cataplexy. It's an episode where they lose muscle control, and her sister filmed that. So we're not going to get that in person. So I think it's kind of weighing up some of the objectives there.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of speaks to that need for blending the methodologies going forward, right, and kind of pulling the best of both, getting that observation in person, and then, the middle of the night, obviously, you're going to get much better digitally unless you're going to sort of sit there by the bed, which would be creepy. The other thing I would build on that, so in terms of what would you not do online if you didn't have to, I wouldn't say I would not do this, but I would say tread carefully, and it requires a lot of expertise, is to do group work online. So we, as we've talked to our moderators, they absolutely are doing online focus groups, but it is a different toolkit. So there are techniques that our moderators use in person. For example, if someone's talking too much, they might, do something like go stand in a certain area that physically sends a signal that, kind of shift the conversation to somebody else that they want to hear from, as an example. So they have to change that entire toolkit to use it online. And we've all been in online meetings where we speak over each other. I don't know if you've been in that situation, but I think I've been in it just about every day. So I think if you just think about that, that is indicative of some of the difficulty of doing group work online. So I definitely wouldn't say don't do it. I would just say do it with somebody who knows how to facilitate that effectively and who has the experience to facilitate that effectively.
Nice. Yeah.
So that said, I think we are just about at our time. So maybe we'll go ahead and wrap it up here and thank everybody for joining us in this conversation. If there are any further questions that we didn't get to, we can certainly address them via email, or if you have any other questions for us, feel free to reach out to us or feel free to reach out to your usual Ipsos contacts.
Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Victoria, for today's really great presentation. I found it really fascinating, and thank you, everyone, for joining us today. There will be an email coming out to you with a link to today's recorded presentation that will come in the next couple of days. Remember, also, there are handouts in the webinar console for more about the research we shared today, so go ahead and download a copy. So that now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.